in verse 5. Pull this up. Hopefully there's no sound there, and hopefully they can hear me. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the Word. What does that mean, he was occupied with the Word? Anybody have any thoughts about what that might mean? Obviously, occupied is from the same root as occupation. And so what it's saying is that's what he was doing. That's what he was engaged in. He was engaged. In fact, it goes on to explain in specifics what he was doing in this occupation, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And so what it's saying is that when Silas and Timothy arrived, we just talked about the fact that Paul at this point was working both as a tent maker during the week and then going to the synagogue on the Sabbaths and reasoning with people. When Silas and Timothy arrived, they found Paul out talking to people and testifying to them about the Christ. And so he was preaching and teaching. And when they opposed and reviled him, and that would be the Jews that he is talking to about Jesus, when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now I'll go to the Gentiles." And of course, that last statement is a fairly well-known statement. There's a couple of things I want to talk about in relation to this. When it says that he shook out his garments, I refer to things like Matthew chapter 10 and verse 14 and Mark 6:11 and Luke 9 and verse 5, all of which are those places where Jesus said, if they don't receive you, then shake the dust off your feet and move on to the next place. Go back to chapter 13 here in the book of Acts as well, and look at this incident in chapter 13 that we saw earlier in verse 51. Acts 13 and verse 51. But they shook off the dust from their feet against them and went to Iconium. And so they had already come across a situation where they were not received, and it says they shook off the dust from their feet. I think the same exact thing is what's going on here. When they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments. He made a public display to them to show, look, you know what, I'm done with you. And then he said, your blood be on your own heads. Now, what does that statement mean, your blood be on your own heads?
He's told them the truth.
Okay.
So now they're answer to God for whether or not they accept it.
Exactly. He's done as much as he can do. He's talked to them and testified to them about who Jesus was. Whatever happens to them at this point is all on them. What they do with the gospel is their business. There's an important point here that I think all of us need to remember and keep in mind. And that is this: we cannot do anything for anyone else. We are not charged to make anyone do anything else. We have no ability to do anything other than what Paul was found doing here, which is being occupied with the Word of God, testifying that Jesus is the Christ. When people decide to reject that testimony, we have met our responsibility. We have done what our duty is. And so as we think about the church and we read passages of Scripture that talk about the church being the pillar and support of the truth, we understand that the church's primary function is to carry the truth and to present it and make it known. We can't make people do things and compel obedience, and we shouldn't try. And that's what Paul is doing here. He's saying, you know what? I've done all I can do for you. I've told you the truth. What you do with it's your business, and your guilt rests on you. The decision you make and how you respond to it is between you and God. And then he says, I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And people make a lot about that statement. All I'm going to say at this point is just remember that he said that. And remember how most of us interpret that. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. I've heard people talk about the fact that he has turned away from the Jews at this point. He's so fed up with them, and he turns and goes and starts preaching to Gentiles. Well, there is a grain of truth in that, but don't make the mistake in believing that he didn't talk to Jews any longer. Don't make the mistake in believing that he didn't continue to try to convert Jews. Don't make the mistake that as he went into a new town that he went, you know what, I'm not going to the synagogue anymore. I'm going to these people. I don't care about the Jews. That's not what's going on here at all. And in fact, I think this is almost a local statement. He is telling the Jews that he is talking to here, you know what, I am done with you here. I'm turning to the Gentiles in the city. And we're gonna see that, I think, as we continue to go through this book. And so just keep that in mind. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. He left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. And so he turns to a Gentile here, but this is not just a generic Gentile off the street that doesn't know anything about God. This is a Gentile who is a worshiper of God. And in fact, it says his house is next door to the synagogue. And so it's even possible that he was a proselyte of sorts. It says, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. And I think this is important as well, because we have this Titius Justus and Crispus that are kind of set up as bookmarks. We got one of them that apparently is not a Jew, and obviously the ruler of the synagogue is a Jew. And both of these people believed in the Lord together with his entire household, it says, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Now, there's something important in this verse that I think we need to pay attention to. Notice when it talks about the ruler of the synagogue, it simply says he believed in the Lord. And then it talks about many of the Corinthians as he turned to the people of the city. Many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. What I would suggest to you is that these two statements, believed in the Lord and believed and were baptized, are set forth as parallel statements that essentially mean the same thing. That both of them are describing a response, a proper response to the gospel. And I got a note here. I need to flip over and check what this is before I bring it up. Yeah. I know why I put that note there now. And so I will go back and pick up on this just a little bit about the fact that he's turning to the Gentiles, and then we have this acknowledgement of a Gentile and this acknowledgement of the ruler of the synagogue who Paul works with. If you go back to Acts chapter 10, verses 34 and 35, this of course is Peter and his work with Cornelius and his household. And the first thing Peter says is, so Peter opened his mouth and said, truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. And so I think we have the same kind of statement being made here, the same kind of point being made, and that is the gospel is made available both to the Jews and the Gentiles, and both Jews and Gentiles respond. But does everyone respond? Did everyone believe? And of course the answer to that is no. Remembering that you go back to where we started, that he was testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus, and they opposed and reviled him for it. And so what we're going to find in life is that when we testify to the truth, and we talk about Jesus, and we talk about who he is, and we tell people about the gospel, that we're going to find people from all walks of life and all areas of life who will respond, and we're going to find people who will respond negatively as well. And we shouldn't be at all shocked by that. And we shouldn't let that discourage us, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to give up. And I'll give you some examples of people, I think, doing just that very thing. You make suggestions sometimes about, well, let's try doing this, or let's go invite people in this neighborhood, or let's go do this, and it never fails that someone says, well, nobody cares about this anymore. Nobody listens. Nobody's interested. Because they have met with the kind of response that Paul had met, being opposed and reviled for their faith, they give up on talking to people about it. And we need to be careful not to do that. We need to have the same attitude that Paul had, which is, you know what? I'm done with you, but I'm going to talk to whoever will listen. It says he left there and went to the house. Well, that's what he got there. Verse 9, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision. So notice now Paul is going to get some revelation from God here. Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. And so even God recognizes the likelihood that Paul is going to be discouraged by the ways he's been received here. Over and over and over again. Remember again, just a couple of cities ago, it was such a negative response that they had to carry him out of town and put him on a ship and ship him off to keep him from being killed. And so God says, don't be afraid, go on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you. And here's the one I like. For no one will attack you or harm you. Does that represent a universal promise to Paul that nothing bad is ever going to happen to him, that he should just boldly preach the gospel and not worry about it? Nothing bad is ever going to be allowed to happen to him because God's with him?
He finishes this in this city.
It does finish where he says, for I have many in this city who are my people. But beyond that, we also know things like 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 20 through 28. Anybody familiar with that passage? If not, if you have your New Testaments with you, flip over to 2 Corinthians for a moment. Chapter 11. We actually could start reading earlier in chapter 11, but I think what we're going to read will be enough. Starting in verse 23. He says, are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman with far greater labors. Listen, he's going to describe himself now. Far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, often near death. In other words, Paul was beaten, but not just beaten, he was beaten near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, dangers from my own people, dangers from Gentiles, dangers from the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of the anxiety of all the churches. And so, Paul's life in walking with God was full of difficulties, hardships, mistreatment, abuse. He was beaten so many times and beaten to the point of death several times. He was stoned. He was beaten with rods. He was beaten with lashes. He was imprisoned countless times. He had lots of trouble. So when God says to him, no one will attack you and harm you, he was not talking about ever. He was talking about in that place. No one will attack you and harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And again, keep in mind, like we just said, just a couple of cities ago, basically the entire town came after Paul. And so God is saying, look, don't lose heart. Keep going, keep talking, and don't worry about things. In this city, I've got lots of allies. There are people here who are devoted to me, and you don't have anything to fear. So just keep talking. And so it says he stayed 1 year and 6 months. Teaching the Word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, now let's talk about this proconsul for a moment. A proconsul was a Roman provincial governor. And so the structure and the structure of Rome changed. When Rome was a republic, the highest elected officials in the land were called consuls. And then they had provincial governors, proconsuls under them. By the time Rome became an empire, an empire, obviously there was an emperor placed over Rome, and he had complete authority, but there were still councils in Rome, and there were still proconsuls under them, and so this is a very important Roman official with a lot of authority in this region. And so this man, Gallio, was proconsul of the region of Achaia. And it says, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. That would be a Roman government tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I know it's been a couple of weeks since we were able to have class last here, but does that sound familiar? This is now, I think, the third time that this charge has been leveled against Paul. It was also essentially the same charge that was leveled against Jesus. And usually the charge that was brought by the Jews when they went to the Romans, they basically said, hey, what they're teaching is against Roman law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, and so Paul's going to answer, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourself. And so what this proconsul says, and he apparently is a shrewd politician, he recognizes this for what it is. He understands that they are trying to use him. And he says, look, y'all are arguing about words. Y'all are arguing about names. You're arguing about this Jesus character, whether he is the Christ. You're arguing about things that pertain to your law, not things that pertain to Rome. And so I have no desire to get into the middle of this squabble. He goes on to say, I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all see Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. And so these guys are frustrated. They're not getting their way. The Roman proconsul is not doing what they want. And so they grab the nearest person that they can, which is the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him. Now, so you don't think that Gallio is some kind of good guy and had some kind of good motives and was actually interested in justice, we're told, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. He didn't care that they were beating a completely innocent individual. He didn't care that they were mistreating Sosthenes. He didn't care what they were actually trying to do to Paul. He cared about himself. And he said, look, you're squabbling about your own stuff. Don't drag me into this and make this a problem for me. You deal with it yourselves. And the way they dealt with it was to beat a completely innocent individual. And he didn't care a whit about that. He didn't raise a finger to stop it. He didn't try to do anything. And so what starts happening, or at this point, I'll say it this way, at this point, the Jews who are carrying on their continual practice that we've seen throughout this, which is when they can't do anything themselves, to appeal to Rome and try to get Rome to do it for them. At this point, some of these Roman proconsuls are getting to the point that they're wise enough to go, you know what? I'm staying out of this. This is nothing but trouble for me. And so they're not being able to do that in some places. And so Paul, it says, after this, he stayed many days longer. We don't know how long that is exactly. He stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. He's going back to Antioch. With him, Priscilla and Aquila. And so his tent maker buddies that he has made in this town and apparently lived with for the last year and a half decide to travel with him. It says at Caesarea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. What is that talking about? Anybody have any ideas or clues? Yeah, the only vow that had anything to do, at least under the law, with this that I'm aware of, and it's talked about in Numbers chapter 6, is the vow of the Nazarite. Now, Nazarite's not some place. Nazarite is a word that means separation, and it had to do with people who had separated themselves for God. And they couldn't touch anything that came from a grapevine. They couldn't be around dead bodies, even if it was their family, their parents, their siblings. They couldn't be around dead bodies. They couldn't go to a funeral. They couldn't cut their hair until the vow was over. And then they were to cut their hair, and there was a process that they were to go through in making certain sacrifices. And I think even you had to do something with the hair. You had to burn the hair in a particular way, in a particular place. Because of that, there are a lot of commentators that argue that this is not talking about the Nazarite vow, because he would have needed to be in Jerusalem to deal with it. But I will point this to you. Flip over to Acts 21 for a minute. We're going to jump ahead for just a second. Acts 21, verses 23 and 24. Do therefore what we tell you. Oh, yeah, that's where I'm at. For we have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but you yourself also live in observance of the law. This is also about Paul. This is after Paul gets back to Jerusalem, and this is actually a way that I think James is suggesting that Paul should act to demonstrate to all the Jews that Paul was not antagonistic toward the Mosaical law. And so there were 4 people who were under the vow with him, and he said, you take them, you go, you pay their expenses, you let them cut their... And what some people have suggested is this is actually where Paul was headed, and that though Paul cut his hair and his vow ended in Caesarea, that he actually made this trip to Jerusalem to do this very thing, and that's why it was suggested to him to take these other people who were under the vow at that time and demonstrate to everybody that he was not antagonistic to the law. I don't know that that's the case either. What I do know is this, that he was under some type of vow to God. And the only vow that I know of that a former Jew would have been familiar with and thought meant anything would have been the Nazarite vow. But whether it was or not, he clearly had engaged in some vow to God that he held. Now, Christianity did not proscribe any such vows. None. And so Paul was not doing this as a tenet of the Christian faith. This was a personal conviction that Paul had. And if you add to it the 2 verses in Acts 21 that we just read, in that place at least, it was connected to, I want you to show that you have no problem with this and have no problem with people doing this, so people understand you don't have a problem with the law. And what I would suggest to you that we can learn from that is this. Matters of personal conviction, I can bind upon myself these things. Paul never asked anyone else to do this. Paul never taught anyone that they had to do this. But apparently, Paul did continue to engage in some kind of private vows to God in which he honored and behaved in a particular way and ended those vows in a particular way, in this case that involved him cutting his hair. And he imposed that upon himself, and whose business was that? His and God's, and nobody else's. And there's no indication in this text, and there's no indication in Acts 21 that there's anything wrong or negative or bad about this. And so we need to be very, very careful about becoming judges of individuals' personal behavior and things that they impose upon themselves. we also need to be very, very careful in imposing our personal convictions on other people if they are not from God. Because when the Jews went about doing that, i.e. back in chapter 15 when they were teaching that you had to be circumcised in order to be a Christian, Paul met them with quite a lot of force to put that teaching down and made it clear that that was not a part of Christianity. And yet here apparently Paul as an individual still keeps portions of the law. There's also another place in the book of Acts, and I don't know if the newer translations include the verse or not. I know the King James does, where it talks about Paul needing to keep the feast. And he went to Jerusalem back to engage in one of the feast days in Jerusalem. This was after Paul was a Christian as well. And so we need to be careful about things. As long as people are not imposing these things on other people or teaching other people that this is a requirement of God, if they're doing it to themselves and keeping it to themselves, I can't fault them. And I think that's an important thing to see here. Again, there is no prescribed vows in Christianity. And so he was not doing this as an act of Christian faith. He was doing this as a personal conviction before God, whatever it was. And so anyway, he does that at Centuria, and then they come to Ephesus, it says in verse 19. And it says, he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Now, do you notice this? Now keep in mind, I told you when we started out tonight, that phrase when he told them in that city, hey, you know what, I'm done with you. He shook off his garments. He makes this big public thing. He said, I'm now turning to the Gentiles. When Paul leaves and he gets to Ephesus, he actually leaves Aquila and Priscilla behind, and he goes and finds the synagogue and begins to reason with the Jews about Christ. And so he was not saying that I am not talking to Jews anymore. He either was saying, I'm not talking to you Jews anymore, or he was making the point that he had come to the realization that the gospel was not to be preached exclusively to the Jews, but he needed to incorporate more Gentiles in his work. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I mean, I can't answer speculative thing. There's a million things it could be. What we're told is he cut his hair for he was under a vow. That's what we're told. And we're not even told specifically which vow that is. But again, the only reason I bring up the Nazirite vow is because in my studies, that's the only even Old Testament vow that involves somebody not cutting their hair until the vow was completed and then cutting it because of the vow. And so that's the only one that really makes any logical sense to me. And it was a vow that was primarily to demonstrate that you are set apart for God, that you're consecrated for God. And that's, I don't know beyond that other than, what we discussed. And it's very important to realize this was not something that Paul taught as a tenet of Christianity. This was not something that Paul imposed upon other people. This was something that he did himself as an act of personal conviction. And there's no indication in the text that he did anything wrong or that we should not. And so, you know what? If y'all want to make some vow that ends with you shaving your head, that's between you and God. I will tell you, if you show up one day with your head shaved, I'm likely to ask, what happened? Don't take it personal. So that's kind of where we're at on that. It says that in Ephesus, as he goes to the synagogue and reasons with the Jews, when they ask him to stay for a longer period, He declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. And after spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And so he goes back into some of the area that he had already done some work, and there have already established churches, and he basically moves from place to place, seeks out the disciples, and strengthens the disciples in these cities, people that had been converted from his earlier work. And so he kind of makes a loop and goes back through and encourages the brethren. And I think there's some important things that we need to think about in regard to that as well, about how important it is for us to strengthen and encourage fellow disciples. Why do we exist? Why does God have us exist as local churches? Why does He have us engage in public worship? Why does He ask us to share the gospel with people? Why do we do these things? Yeah. Okay, there's an aspect, I think you're right, there is a test. Are we willing to do what we've been asked to do? And here's the bottom line in this. I'm not here to make people's life worse. I'm not here to destroy people. I'm not here to make shipwreck of people's faith. I'm not here to become a stumbling block to others. We're on the earth and we have been called as children to strengthen the faith of people around us, to encourage them, to edify them, build them up, develop their faith, to be a source of encouragement, to be a source of help. And we need to let that sink in. Now, we read a little earlier from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, all of these terrible things that Paul went through. How easy would it be to quit doing what Paul did if that's how you were received and treated? And there's that one section in there that I think we read through sometimes and don't really grasp completely the significance of it. Is that 1 or 2? I like that. He said, these things have happened and I've been treated poorly by the Jews and by the Gentiles. And those are bookend statements. That's a dichotomous situation. Someone was either a Jew or they were a Gentile. Paul's point is, listen, I got mistreated by people of all walks of life. The Jews mistreated me, some Gentiles mistreated me. And so it wasn't like you say, well, the Jews were terrible to Paul, and so he turned to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles loved him, and life was great after that. No, it didn't work that way. The Jews mistreated Paul, and the Gentiles mistreated Paul. And then he says, it happened in the city, and it happened in the wilderness. Which means what? It wasn't a place or a location. It wasn't one place, one city, one event. This stuff happened to him everywhere he went, from all manner of different people, in all sorts of different circumstances. He met with resistance and abuse and mocking and scourging. He had the exact same response from people that Jesus had gotten. How easy would it be for him to say, you know what, I'm just fed up with all of this. I'm just going to sit quietly somewhere, keep to myself, and mind my own business. I'm going to quit talking to people. But he understood something. He understood it was his responsibility to strengthen all the disciples. He understood it was his responsibility to testify that Jesus is the Christ. And if that meant that he was mistreated, then he suffered. And we have to be absolutely sure that we don't allow ourselves to become complacent and willing to do and say nothing because we are afraid of what might happen. Remember again that message from God as Paul was facing all of this stuff. Don't be afraid. Keep talking. I have people. By the way, anybody remember that message to anybody else? Essentially the exact same message? Elijah. When Elijah thought that he was the only one left serving God and sat down under the juniper tree and wanted to give up and quit, God said, no, you do what I told you to do and realize that I have other people who are mine. Don't worry about it. They're out there. You're going to meet people who respond positively to you. You're going to meet people who are grateful that you share the gospel with them. You're going to meet people who help you and who strengthen you and who treat you well. You're not just going to meet people who resist and who fight and who mistreat you. And the church today, I think, in large part, needs to be very careful not to be satisfied to just sit within our own buildings among ourselves and not cause any problems, not make anybody mad, not have anything happen to us because we don't say or do anything anymore. A church should not exist in a community and people not know who we are and what we believe and what we're advocating. We should be driven to help build faith in others, and to not allow nonsense to get in the way. And we can even learn from godless Roman leaders to not get involved in stuff that's not our business. And to not nitpick and worry about things. And that's where, Romans 14 to some degree comes in. You're not another servant's judge. I tell you, Paul keeping that vow, whatever that vow was, and getting his hair cut and going through all this process, I think we'd have some brethren today who probably would attack Paul and say, hey, that has no part in Christianity. You can't do that. And he wasn't asking anybody else to do anything. He was doing what he believed he should do. And we need to learn from these things. They're recorded for us to learn. And we do know that he made efforts to make it clear to the Jews that he didn't have any issues with the law. And we know that he made effort when he was among the Gentiles to not become a stumbling block to them because of some of the things that he might have still held on to. I don't know how quick Paul was to start eating pork and shellfish and the other things that were forbidden for his entire life for him to eat. I don't know how quick he was to change those aspects of his life, but he tried really, really hard not to allow that to get in between him and his Gentile interactions. And he tried to open himself up as much as possible to not allow those personal things to interfere with his work. I became all things to all men that I might save some. And so that's an effort that we need to make as well, to make sure that we are not stumbling blocks to the people around us, to make sure that we are strengthening the people around us, because that's what we're here for. Anybody else have any comments or questions? If the Lord wills, we'll begin next time around verse 24 in chapter 18. And appreciate those that have been watching online. I haven't seen any questions pop up from that group. So in the future, guys, you use the comments to ask questions if you have them, or to make comments, and I will try to incorporate them in the class as well.